This is the story of Shorty, a man whose imperfect music defied a world ruled by the cold perfection of machines. A forbidden note sparked a revolution, but it also turned him into a fugitive. What will he sacrifice to restore the soul of a city that has forgotten it? Shorty buried his face in his hands, feeling the weight of accumulated time pressing down on his shoulders. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed in his mind, the memory of applause he hadn't heard in decades. Around him, only the rhythmic silence of his room, occasionally broken by the metallic sound of musical cones seeping through the walls. Yet there it was, like a silent witness, his trombone resting in the corner of the room, wrapped in the black bag that had shielded it from the indifference of the outside world. He rose abruptly, almost violently. Striding toward the instrument, he unwrapped it and let the desk lamp's light caress its metallic surface. The cold brass against his fingers shot through him like lightning, awakening a chill that went beyond mere nostalgia. For an instant, past and present blurred, and he could see himself standing in a crowded church, the organ behind him, and his trombone resonating with the notes of Silent Night. His heart pounded in rhythm with that memory, but the reverie shattered suddenly. A distant, mechanical wail emanating from the musical cone on the floor below tore through the air. It was the sterile echo of perfect music, free of human error. Shorty closed his eyes, letting rage simmer within him. "Perfect," he muttered under his breath, as if arguing with an invisible foe. His hand, seemingly acting on its own, brushed the trombone's keys. The urge to play was nearly irresistible, but he recalled the severe face of Mrs. Thompson, who was surely listening, ever vigilant to punish any disobedience. At the end of the hallway, the clock struck 9 at night, the hour when the building fell into complete silence, ruled by the dominance of the musical cones. Outside, snow began to gather on the windowsills, mirroring the cold that also reigned in the hearts of those who had traded the soul of musicians for lifeless perfection. Shorty sat back down in front of the trombone, staring at it as if it were an old friend he had betrayed. Maybe just one note, he thought. A sharp knock interrupted his contemplation. It was the door. Without needing to look, he knew Mrs. Thompson was on the other side. Night had fallen with a thick, icy shroud, but the city was not silent. Everywhere, musical cones played carols with a precision that, far from comforting, filled the air with a chilling monotony. From his room, Shorty watched the snow pile up on the streets through a fogged-up window. The dim glow of a street lamp illuminated his trombone, lying open on the table. He had tried to ignore it, to resist the temptation, but something inside him simmered with uncontrollable force. With trembling hands, he approached the instrument. Just this once, he told himself, searching for excuses to justify it. He picked up the trombone, feeling its familiar weight and the metallic texture in his hands. Closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, he blew. A single deep note shattered the perfection of the atmosphere, reverberating with an unmistakably human imperfection. Barely 2 seconds passed before a furious pounding came from the door. "Mr. Shorty," bellowed Mrs. Thompson's voice, as sharp as the winter wind. I've put up with a lot from you, but this is intolerable. If you play that instrument again, I'll call Inspector Nelson immediately." Shorty stood motionless, the trombone still in his hands. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he almost returned the instrument to its case, but something ignited within him. A spark. A rage accumulated over years. He straightened up, fixing his gaze on the closed door, and, with more calm than he felt, replied, "Do what you must, Mrs. Thompson. It's Christmas Eve, and I'm going to play." The pounding on the door continued, but Shorty no longer heard it. Instead, he began to prepare. He found his worn-out coat and woolen gloves. As he put them on, memories flooded over him. Christmases when he played for the church, filled with children and smiling families. The warm applause he received after finishing each carol. He saw himself as a passionate young man, surrounded by a community that valued music for what it was. Imperfect, yes, but real. That world had disappeared, buried under technology and the oppressive rules of the musical cones. But as he laced up his boots, a dark doubt crept into his mind. What if he went out to play and no one listened? What if he was stopped before even finishing a single song? The thought that his music could be considered an act of subversion was terrifying, but also intoxicating. Resistance, he thought, could begin with just one note. With his trombone slung over his shoulder and snow falling in heavy, thick flakes, Shorty left the building without looking back. His breath formed clouds in the air, but he pressed forward with firm steps. He didn't know exactly where he would play, only that he must. Not for himself, but for everything that had been lost. The snow crunched beneath Shorty's feet as he walked through the deserted streets. Christmas lights hung over the sidewalks, casting colorful reflections on the mounds of ice. But there was no warmth in the atmosphere. The distant echo of the musical cones followed him like a shadow, reminding him of the world he sought to challenge. He quickened his pace toward the church, his trombone swaying with every step, as if the very act of walking was a small act of defiance. As he turned the corner, he spotted the tall figure of Reverend Blaine, who was adjusting the candles on an iron candelabra placed at the church's entrance. His black cassock billowed in the wind, and his kind expression lit up upon recognizing Shorty. "Shorty," Blaine exclaimed, his smile seemingly genuine, though faint. "What a surprise to see you here on a night like this. Are you coming to midnight mass?" Shorty hesitated, stopping a few steps away. There was something in the Reverend's gaze that had always been hard to read, as if behind his kindness lay a subtle disapproval. "I'm not sure, Reverend," he finally replied. "Maybe I just wanted to stop by, to remember how things used to be." Blaine studied him, his eyes lingering on the trombone in Shorty's hand. He couldn't suppress a faint smile, a mix of nostalgia and resignation. "That trombone," he murmured. "You used to play it around this time of year, didn't you? There wasn't a Christmas Mass without your carols, but times change, Shorty. Now we have something better." The Reverend pulled a pamphlet from his pocket and handed it to him. Shorty took it with gloved hands, glancing at the image on the cover. A massive, golden musical cone placed where the church's organ had once stood. It's magnificent, isn't it? Blaine continued, his eyes shining. This cone reproduces the most sublime music, free of errors, free of hesitation. It's as if God himself speaks through its notes. Isn't that what we've always wanted? Shorty tightened his grip on the pamphlet, feeling anger begin to burn in his chest. "And what about the soul, Blaine?" he said, his voice cracking. "What about humanity? The mistakes, the passion? How can something mechanical replace that?" Blaine sighed, leaning slightly closer to Shorty as if to share a secret. "Sometimes, to move forward, we have to let go of what we love," he said in a soft, almost paternal tone. "Edith understands. She's told me she's worried about you, that you refuse to accept the world as it is now. She wants you to be happy, Shorty, but you can't achieve that by clinging to the past." The name Edith hit him like a blow. Shorty felt a lump in his throat and looked away. Blaine stepped back, giving him space. "Think about it, my friend. There's a place for everyone in this new world, even for those who doubt. Come to the Mass. Perhaps you'll find answers in the music." The Reverend returned to the church, leaving Shorty alone under the flickering street lamp. He held the pamphlet for a moment longer before crumpling it and stuffing it into his coat pocket. He took a step toward the church, but something held him back. Blaine's words echoed in his mind. Edith understands. Did she really? Or had she simply lost faith in him? Shorty looked toward the hill on the other side of the city, where the lights were fewer and farther between. There, away from the cones and their hollow notes, he might find his true answer. He adjusted his trombone over his shoulder and walked away, leaving the church and Reverend Blaine behind. The church was illuminated like a beacon in the darkness of the night. The stained glass windows cast colorful reflections on the snow, and the wide-open main door invited the faithful to the midnight mass. Shorty paused at the threshold, taking a deep breath as a celestial choir resonated within. However, as he stepped inside, the perfect, impersonal sound of the musical cone hit him like a cold slap. The massive golden apparatus stood at the center of the altar, replacing the old organ Shorty used to play. Its pipes were silent, covered in dust, almost invisible in the dim light. The cone turned slowly on its pedestal, emitting crystal-clear, flawless notes, but entirely devoid of soul. There were no children's choirs, no human errors, no life. Shorty turned around, unable to bear the sight any longer. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Piling up on the church's stone steps, he stopped halfway down, looking at the small group of people gathered silently to listen to the cone's carols, as if they were witnessing an unmatched masterpiece. But Shorty knew better. This wasn't the spirit of music, nor the spirit of Christmas. With a resolute motion, he took out his trombone. The cold metal stung his fingers, but the warmth of determination drove him forward. He raised the instrument to his lips and blew. The first note was deep, imperfect, and raw, echoing through the church walls and the surrounding streets. Several people turned, their faces showing a mix of surprise and curiosity. Shorty didn't stop. He began playing Silent Night. With all his heart, the notes stumbling over each other, his breaths interrupting the melody. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Each vibration of the trombone resonated as a challenge to the cold and emptiness imposed by the musical cones. The group of people started murmuring. Some children approached, captivated by the strange sound, not perfect, but stirring something unfamiliar, almost forgotten. Warmth. "Stop right there," an authoritative voice yelled. Shorty kept playing, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw Inspector Nelson approaching with a determined stride. Dressed in his immaculate uniform, his eyes reflected more irritation than anger. "This is an illegal act of disturbing the peace," Nelson declared, pointing a stern finger at Shorty. "Put that instrument down immediately." Shorty paused briefly, lowering the trombone but not letting it go. "I'm not disturbing the peace," he replied with a trembling voice. "I'm reminding us of what it means." Nelson wasn't in the mood for debate. He took 2 steps closer, extending his hand toward the trombone. "Mr. Shorty, I'm asking you to hand it over. Don't make me take it by force." The crowd watched in absolute silence. Shorty clutched the instrument tightly, as if letting go would mean losing a part of himself. But as Nelson moved closer, Shorty finally lowered his arm and handed over the trombone. The inspector took it firmly and turned to the onlookers. "This man will be taken into custody for violating local ordinances. Return to your homes," he ordered. 2 officers cuffed him and escorted him to the nearby police car. Shorty didn't say a word. From the back seat, he watched as Nelson placed the trombone in the vehicle's trunk, and something inside him broke. It wasn't just the instrument, it was the last remnant of what his life had been. In the cell, the silence was absolute. Without the trombone in his hands, Shorty felt empty, more alone than he had ever been. He stared at his bare, calloused hands, worn from years of playing, and thought of everything the world had changed, everything he had lost. The imperfect notes, the warm applause, the children humming his songs, now all reduced to dust in his memory. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the cold bars of the cell, but deep in his mind, he could still hear the echo of the last note he played, resonating like a promise. He hadn't given up, not yet. The cell door creaked open at dawn. Shorty stepped out slowly, his hands buried in the pockets of his worn coat. Feeling the morning's biting cold hit his face with a particular harshness. He didn't look at the officer escorting him to the exit, nor did he respond to the murmurs of the few people passing by the station. His mind was trapped in a spiral. His trombone remained confiscated, and with it, a part of himself seemed stuck in that gray room where Nelson had left it the night before. The city was unchanged. The musical cones began their morning repertoire, flooding the streets with perfect notes. But Shorty barely heard them. In his pocket, he held a crumpled piece of paper with an address, a message from Edith that had arrived while he was locked up. "Meet me at the usual cafe at 3. I want to talk to you." At exactly 3 o'clock, Shorty arrived at the small cafe on a corner downtown. The place was nearly empty, with only a few tables occupied by customers engrossed in their phones as they sipped coffee. Edith sat by the window, her face softly lit by the weak winter sunlight. She wore a beige coat, and her hands rested on a cup that seemed to warm her more inside than out. When she saw him enter, she looked up and smiled, though the warmth in her eyes couldn't entirely mask the shadow of concern hidden behind them. "Shorty, I'm glad to see you," she said as he sat across from her. "Are you okay? I heard what happened last night." He nodded, unsure of what to say. Edith's presence had always comforted him, but this time there was something different in her expression, something that made him uneasy. "I'm fine, I guess," he replied, fiddling with the paper napkin in front of him. "It wasn't the first time Nelson cuffed me, though this time, I feel like I lost something more." Edith studied him carefully, as if choosing her words with precision. "Shorty, what you did. I understand why you did it, but you can't keep living this way, clinging to the past as if the world hadn't changed. People they don't see things the way you do. They don't feel the same way about that music." Shorty looked up, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "Not even you, Edith?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't you feel like we lost something when we stopped playing our own songs?" Edith sighed, pulling her hands away from the cup and folding them on the table. "It's not that, Shorty. It's that the world moves on. You can't stay trapped in what was. Look, She paused, as if struggling to continue. "I've been seeing someone, Del Gentry. He asked me to go with him to Christmas Eve Mass, and I think I'm going to say yes." The words hit him like a blow. Shorty felt the air leave his chest, as if Edith had just taken away the little comfort he had left. For a moment, everything became a blur. Edith's words mingling with the sound of the cones filtering in from the street. "Del Gentry?" he repeated with a bitter smile. "The guy who talks about how musical cones are the future of humanity? I guess you'll make a good match." Edith shook her head, sadness in her eyes. "That's not fair, Shorty. This isn't just about the cones or the music. It's about you, about how you hold on to something that doesn't exist anymore. I can't keep being the person trying to bring you back to the present. I'm sorry." Shorty stood from the table, unable to stay a moment longer. "Then I guess you should go to that mass," he said, not looking back as he headed for the door. "I'm sure you'll love it." He wandered aimlessly through the streets, his hands in his pockets and his gaze fixed on the ground. The world around him felt more distant than ever. Every sound from the musical cones was a mockery. Every face that passed him a reminder of how disconnected he was from a society that had forgotten what it meant to feel. That night, Shorty returned to his room and sat at the empty table where his trombone used to be. The absence was unbearable, but something inside him still burned. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let it all end like this. He looked out the window, where the snow continued to fall, and swore to himself he would do whatever it took to reclaim not just his trombone, but what it represented. The snow fell incessantly, blanketing the streets in white, muffling the sound of footsteps, and making the city feel like a frozen painting. Shorty walked without direction, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, his breath forming warm clouds in front of his face. Around him, the musical cones played their endless repertoire of carols, each flawless note resonating with precision, devoid of emotion. He turned a corner and found himself in a small park. Christmas lights hung between the trees, but the scene was far from festive. A group of children had improvised a performance in front of a snow-covered bench where a couple of adults watched with a mix of fatigue and boredom. The children wore wool hats and oversized gloves, but their laughter was not of joy. It was of mockery. "I'm a musical cone," one of them shouted, singing an exaggerated and robotic version of Jingle Bells. Another child, mimicking a mechanical voice, responded, "Perfect, perfect, no errors." The others laughed, clapping and making faces. One of them, a boy with messy hair, carried a portable speaker that synchronized his voice with the musical cones. Whenever someone tried to sing naturally, the device would intervene, adjusting the melody until it became cold and artificial. Shorty stopped to watch, a mix of disbelief and sadness washing over him. There was something profoundly unsettling about the scene. Children, who should be symbols of spontaneity and imagination, mocking imperfection, as if it were an intolerable flaw. One of them noticed him and pointed in his direction. "Hey, look," the boy shouted, pointing a gloved finger. "It's one of those old guys who still thinks he can play real music." Laughter erupted, and the boy with the speaker approached, swinging it like a trophy. "Do you also believe music comes from hands and not machines?" he taunted. "We don't need people like you to make music. The cones do everything better." The comment hit like a slap. For a moment, Shorty felt the child's words encapsulated everything the world had come to believe. It was the echo of a society that had abandoned humanity in favor of inhuman perfection. His first instinct was to walk away, ignore them, let the cold night extinguish the fire beginning to blaze in his chest. But something stopped him. He looked at the children, at their young faces and mocking eyes, then at the speaker still emitting the sterile perfection of the musical cones. Suddenly, he understood that it wasn't just his music at stake. It was something bigger, something deeper. Their mockery wasn't just directed at him, but at everything he represented: imperfection, humanity, effort, error. Everything that made music not just sound, but life. "Do you really believe that?" he said, his voice low but firm. The children stopped laughing, surprised by the intensity in his eyes. "Do you really think a machine can replace what's inside us? That a cone can sing with the soul you're losing yourselves?" The boy with the speaker fell silent, unsure how to respond. The others stepped back a bit, uneasy. Shorty took a step forward, his tall, dark silhouette framed against the snow. "One day," he continued, his tone softer, "you'll miss what you never learned to value. And when that happens, you'll realize machines can't give you what you're looking for, because what you're looking for isn't in them. It's here," he said, placing a hand over his chest. The group dispersed slowly, leaving Shorty alone in the park. He gazed at the lights twinkling among the trees and felt something shift within him. He wasn't fighting for a trombone. He wasn't fighting for a simple act of rebellion. He was fighting for what made humans human: passion, soul, the ability to make mistakes and learn from them. As he walked toward the city's highest hill, where the snow seemed purer and the air colder, Shorty swore he wouldn't let those truths fade without a fight. Music wasn't just notes, it was everything the cones could never understand. And as long as there was someone willing to play it, it wouldn't be entirely lost. The snow continued to fall heavily as Shorty climbed the city's highest hill, his heart weighed down by the resolution he had made. He couldn't stop now. The idea had grown within him like an uncontrollable flame. For his music to mean something, he had to reclaim it. He had to play his trombone one last time in a place where everyone could hear it, even if it cost him everything. From the summit, he could see the city stretched out like a tapestry of twinkling lights. Every home, every street, every corner echoed with the same impersonal music from the cones. That empty perfection, leaving no room for error or feeling, weighed heavily on his soul. He rested his hands on his knees, breathing deeply. The police station was only a few streets away, but he knew what he was about to do would change everything. He slid through the shadows until he reached the entrance of the building. Most of the interior lights were off, except for a small desk in the lobby where a lone guard dozed, his head resting on a pile of papers. From his position, Shorty could see the display cases where confiscated items were stored. And there it was, his trombone, resting on a shelf like a forgotten trophy. He entered silently, ensuring his steps didn't echo on the tiles. The guard didn't move. Shorty advanced slowly, his pulse racing and his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the shelf, a lump formed in his throat at the sight of the instrument so close. He stretched out his hand and grabbed the trombone, trying not to make a sound as he lifted it. "Who's there?" growled a voice behind him. Shorty turned abruptly, finding the guard staring at him with half-closed, still sleepy but alert eyes. The tension in the air spiked. The man stepped forward, his hand reaching for the communicator on his belt. "Don't move," he ordered. "It's mine," Shorty replied, clutching the trombone tightly as if letting go was impossible. "I just came for what belongs to me." The guard frowned and stepped closer. His movement was swift, attempting to snatch the trombone, but Shorty reacted instinctively. With a sudden twist, he shoved the man, who lost his balance and fell backward, hitting a metal table. The sound was deafening, and the guard lay on the ground groaning, clutching his side. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Shorty stared at the injured man, his mind overwhelmed by the horror of what he had just done. But he couldn't stop now. He heard the distant echo of footsteps approaching, likely drawn by the noise, and knew he had to get out of there. With the trombone in hand, he ran out of the station, his feet slipping on the snow as the voices of the police began shouting orders behind him. The city, so familiar, now became a hostile labyrinth. He ducked into alleyways and dark paths, trying to lose his pursuers. Finally, he reached the outskirts, where the lights were sparser and the snow blanketed everything in an almost absolute silence. He stopped to catch his breath, his body trembling as much from the cold as from the adrenaline. He clutched the trombone to his chest, feeling its weight as both a burden and a comfort. The price of his decision was becoming increasingly clear. He had crossed a line, and now he was a fugitive. The world he had tried to challenge had pushed him even further away. But as he looked toward the hill where he planned to play his music for the city, he felt that he couldn't turn back. Everything he had lost, everything he had sacrificed, had led him to this moment. With the trombone firmly in his hands, he continued toward the hill, determined to make every note count, no matter the cost. The snow kept falling, but Shorty walked with the resolve of someone who had nothing left to lose. Shorty reached the top of the hill just as the first light of dawn began to tint the horizon with a faint pink glow. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't stop. He looked around, taking in the city spread out at his feet, its empty streets and snow-covered rooftops. From there, the twinkling lights of the musical cones resembled artificial stars, but their cold, impersonal sounds couldn't fill the void of the early morning. With trembling hands, he took the trombone out of its case. It had been a long journey to reclaim it, and now that it was his again, the weight of what he was about to do was crushing. Even so, he raised the instrument to his lips and closed his eyes. The world was silent, waiting. The first note was low, clumsy, as if the trombone had forgotten how to sing. But Shorty didn't stop. He adjusted his fingers, took a deep breath, and played again. This time, the note resonated more clearly, vibrating in the icy air. The sound expanded like a wave, rolling down the hill toward the city. It was imperfect, rough, filled with human nuances that no machine could replicate. As the notes flowed, something began to change. The lights of the musical cones in the nearby houses flickered, as if the music was interfering with their function. One by one, the cones shut off, leaving an absolute silence broken only by the echo of Shorty's trombone. In their beds, the city's residents stirred, unsettled by the unexpected change. An old man opened his window, leaning into the cold to hear the sound coming from the hill more clearly. A mother paused as she poured coffee into a cup, surprised by an unfamiliar warmth that seemed to envelop her. A child, who had never heard a melody that didn't come from a cone, sat up in bed, his eyes wide with wonder. The music flowed through the city like a living river, and with each note it awakened something that had been dormant for far too long. It wasn't perfect, but within its imperfections lay something the cones could never offer: soul. Shorty played a carol he had learned as a child, letting nostalgia, pain, and hope pour through every sound. He wasn't playing to be heard. He was playing to remember. Standing atop the hill, Shorty felt something inside him break free, as if all the chains binding him to his past had snapped. In that moment, he understood he wasn't fighting just for his music. He was fighting for the ability of people to feel, to connect, to be human in a world that seemed to have forgotten what that meant. When he finished playing, the echo of the final note lingered in the air, fading slowly. In the city below, the lights of the cones began to flicker back on, but something had shifted. People no longer looked at the cones with the same indifference. Some searched for old instruments they had tucked away years ago. Others simply sat, reflecting on what they had just heard. Shorty lowered the trombone and hugged it to his chest. He was exhausted, but a sense of peace washed over him, a peace he hadn't felt in years. He had played not to defy the world, but to remind it that there was still something worth fighting for. And, for a brief moment, he knew his music had accomplished the impossible. The echo of Shorty's trombone still hung in the air when a murmur began to rise from the city streets. One by one, neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the sound that had broken the mechanical monotony of the musical cones. At first, their expressions were of irritation, confused by what they assumed was a malfunction in their perfect devices. But, as their steps carried them toward the hill, their irritation gave way to curiosity, and then to wonder. Shorty stood at the top, the trombone dangling from his hand as he watched people begin to gather at the foot of the hill. The crowd grew quickly. There were familiar faces among them, neighbors from his building, men and women who barely acknowledged him in the elevator, children who had once mocked his trombone. And, to his surprise, Edith was there too, wrapped in her beige coat, her expression a mix of bewilderment and something Shorty couldn't quite place. Some began to shout. "What's happening?" an older man exclaimed. "This shouldn't be possible. The cones never fail." "Is that music? Real?" a woman asked, clutching her husband's arm. "It's him," a young man said, pointing at Shorty. "It's the old man with the trombone. He's behind all of this." The murmurs swelled into a cacophony of questions and accusations, but Shorty didn't move. He raised the trombone to his lips once more, and before the crowd could react, he blew another note, long and deep, that thundered over their heads. The sound enveloped them, silencing them instantly. Then he began to play again, and a soft, melancholic melody that seemed to resonate directly in the hearts of those who listened. One by one, the angry faces began to change. Disbelief turned to wonder, and wonder into something deeper. Some closed their eyes as if the music transported them to long-buried memories. Others held hands, silently sharing the moment they were experiencing. Even the children, who had initially mocked Shorty, now stared wide-eyed, captivated. Edith stepped forward, weaving her way through the crowd. Tears filled her eyes as she listened to the melody. There was something in that music that no machine could replicate. Each note was imbued with life, imperfection, and truth. For the first time, she saw Shorty for who he truly was. Not a man stuck in the past, but someone courageous enough to remind everyone of what they had lost. The moment of calm, however, was abruptly shattered by the sound of sirens. A police vehicle pulled up at the base of the hill, and Inspector Nelson stepped out, flanked by several officers. His face was set with grim determination. "This ends now," he shouted, pointing at Shorty. "Put down the trombone and come down from the hill. You're under arrest for inciting public disorder." Shorty didn't respond. Instead, he kept playing, letting the music be his only answer. The crowd began to stir uneasily. Some looked at Nelson with apprehension, but others stepped forward, positioning themselves between the inspector and Shorty. "Leave him alone," a woman shouted, raising her voice. "He's not doing anything wrong," added an older man standing in front of Nelson. "He's just playing music. Since when is that a crime?" "His music makes us feel alive," a young woman yelled. "The cones can't do that." Nelson hesitated, clearly taken aback by the crowd's reaction. The officers beside him looked uneasy, unsure of how to proceed. Taking advantage of the confusion, Edith stepped forward until she was standing beside Shorty. She looked at him with a mix of admiration and sorrow, then, without saying a word, turned to face the inspector. "If you want to arrest him, you'll have to arrest all of us," she said firmly. The crowd began to chant in support, forming a protective circle around Shorty. Nelson clenched his teeth but didn't give the order to advance. He knew confronting such a large group could spiral into chaos beyond his control. Shorty stopped playing and lowered the trombone slowly, looking at the crowd that now shielded him. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he thought he had lost: hope. The music had done more than he expected. It hadn't just broken the city's silence, it had awakened something even the musical cones couldn't suppress. Shorty's trial became an event that divided the city. From the moment he was taken into court in handcuffs, the streets buzzed with rumors and debates. Some saw him as a troublemaker who had jeopardized the established order, while others regarded him as a symbol of resistance, a spark that had ignited something dormant in their hearts. In the courtroom, Shorty sat silently, his hands resting on the table before him. His trombone, once again confiscated, was absent, but it felt as though the music he had played still lingered in the air, an invisible presence filling the room. The murmurs of the audience faded as the judge, a stern man with gray hair, banged his gavel to begin the proceedings. The prosecutor, a cold and methodical man, presented the case against Shorty as a clear violation of public order laws. The defendant acted with blatant disregard for the regulations designed to ensure peace and harmony in our society, he declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Shorty. He disrupted hundreds of citizens, caused a temporary blackout of the musical cones, and disobeyed direct orders from authorities. This cannot go unpunished. Shorty remained still, listening without flinching. He knew that, in the eyes of the law, he was guilty. He hadn't tried to hide it. But when the judge gave him the floor to speak in his defense, he rose slowly, his movements heavy with the weight of what was at stake. "I'm not here to deny what I did," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I played my trombone because I couldn't bear the silence anymore. Not the real silence, but the emptiness those musical cones have left in our lives. Their sounds are perfect, yes, but what have they taken from us?" He paused, letting his words resonate in the room. Several people in the audience bowed their heads, avoiding his gaze. "When I played that night, it wasn't to defy the law. It was to remind us that we are human, that music isn't just a collection of orderly notes, but an expression of what's inside us, our flaws, our joys, our sorrows. And if I have to pay a price for that, I'm willing to accept it." The courtroom fell into a tense silence. For a moment, even the prosecutor seemed to waver, but before the judge could respond, a figure rose from the audience. It was Edith. "Your Honor, may I speak?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The judge regarded her warily, but eventually nodded. Edith stepped forward, standing beside Shorty. Her face was serious, but her eyes shone with unshakable determination. "I've known Shorty my entire life," she began. "I always thought he was stuck in the past, unable to adapt to the changes in our world. But that night, when I heard his music, I realized something I had forgotten: what it means to feel. His notes weren't perfect, but they were alive, and that's something the musical cones, as wonderful as they are, will never be able to give us." She paused, searching for the right words. "I don't think what Shorty did that night was a crime. It was a reminder, not to destroy what we have now, but to find balance, to ensure we don't forget that we are human. And if that's a crime, then perhaps we all need to reconsider what we're defending." The audience began murmuring, divided between those who clapped softly and those who still believed Shorty deserved punishment. The judge banged his gavel again, calling for order. When the court retired to deliberate, Shorty felt calmer than he had expected. He knew his fate was in their hands, but he also knew that his music had accomplished something far greater than he had imagined. It didn't matter if he ended up in prison. What mattered was that he had planted a seed. As he left the courtroom, he saw many familiar faces. Some of the children from the park looked at him with newfound respect, and an older man shook his hand. Edith stayed by his side, offering a smile that conveyed more than words ever could. Shorty didn't know what the verdict would be, but in that moment, he realized he had won something far more valuable. His music was no longer just his own. It had become a call, an echo that had begun to resonate in the hearts of those who had listened. And that, he thought, was worth any sacrifice. When the prison doors opened, Shorty stepped out slowly, cautiously. The cold air hit his face, and for a moment, the outside world felt unreal. Months had passed since he'd been locked away, but inside, something had changed. Despite everything, a sense of hope kept him standing. A small group waited for him outside. Edith stood at the front, wearing the beige coat he'd always liked. Beside her, some neighbors from his building and familiar faces from the trial audience held signs with messages like, "Music makes us human," and "Thank you, Shorty, for giving us back our soul." Seeing them, a lump formed in his throat. Edith was the first to approach. Without saying a word, she wrapped a scarf around his neck and smiled. "I told you," she whispered. "This is bigger than you or me." The rest of the group surrounded him, offering hugs and words of encouragement. Shorty, who had grown used to being ignored by his community, felt overwhelmed by the warmth of their welcome. As they began walking toward the city, something caught his attention, a sound he hadn't heard in a long time. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but no. A group of children was playing improvised instruments in a nearby park, laughing as they tried to follow the beat of a battered drum. A little further ahead, a woman practiced on an acoustic guitar on her doorstep, and a group of neighbors sang a carol together on a street corner. "What's happening?" Shorty asked, stopping to take it all in. Edith smiled, looking at him with pride. "It's what you started. When people heard your music, something awakened in them. They realized not everything needs to be perfect, that there's value in the human, the imperfect. Now they're dusting off old instruments singing in the streets, even forming groups to teach music to children. Shorty kept walking, watching as the city he had known his entire life seemed to come alive again. The musical cones were still present, their flawless music pouring from windows, but they were no longer the absolute rulers of sound. Their dominance had been displaced by laughter, off-key chords, and spontaneous songs echoing on every corner. When he arrived at his building, a surprise awaited him. On the table in the lobby, someone had left a package tied with a red ribbon. He opened it carefully, his breath catching in his chest. It was his trombone, polished and gleaming like new. Inside the box was a handwritten note. "Your music changed our lives. Thank you for reminding us what it means to feel." With the trombone in hand, he climbed to his apartment. Everything was just as he had left it, but the emptiness was gone. Instead, every corner felt filled with possibilities. He walked to the window and, for a moment, watched the snow falling over the city. Then he lifted the trombone to his lips and began to play. The first notes were like a greeting to a world he now understood better than ever. From the street, Edith looked up, smiling as she heard the familiar sound. It wasn't perfect, but that was what made it special. It was real. It was human. In the days and weeks that followed, Shorty no longer played alone. People of all ages began gathering in the park, bringing instruments, improvising songs, and sharing stories. The musical cones didn't disappear, but now they were just one option among many, no longer the only one. The city had found its balance. Shorty returned to his life, but he was no longer the same. He had gone from being a lonely man trapped in the past to becoming the catalyst for profound change. His music was no longer just his own. It belonged to the community, to a world that, thanks to him, had rediscovered the power of imperfection. The city's central square glowed under the warm light of hundreds of lanterns strung between buildings. Snow blanketed the ground, but it didn't stop people from gathering, wrapped in thick coats, scarves, and hats, waiting for something that had already become a new tradition: Shorty's Christmas Eve concert. In the center of the square, Shorty adjusted his trombone under the lights of the giant Christmas tree. Around him, a motley group of children and adults prepared to sing. Many held old instruments, guitars with worn strings, harmonicas, wooden flutes. Some children brought small drums and jingle bells, shaking them enthusiastically. The scene, full of life and energy, stood in stark contrast to the days when the city was ruled solely by the musical cones. Shorty looked at the crowd that had gathered. There were families, couples, and groups of friends, all with expectant expressions. On one side of the square, Edith stood with her hands in the pockets of her coat. When their eyes met, she smiled, and Shorty felt his heart skip a beat. That smile was different. It held warmth and something more: recognition, acceptance. The murmurs of the crowd faded as Shorty raised his trombone. The chorus of children and adults positioned themselves behind him, and the air filled with palpable anticipation. Shorty took a deep breath and blew the first note. The sound resonated through the square, imperfect and rough, but full of soul. As he played, The children and adults began to sing, their voices blending into a mix of tones, some on pitch, others not quite, but all brimming with emotion. The notes spilled out like a wave of warmth, wrapping the crowd in an invisible embrace. Throughout the square, people began to sing along. Some hummed, while others belted out the lyrics boldly. It didn't matter whether their voices were good or bad. What mattered was that they were sharing something the musical cones could never provide: connection. Edith slowly made her way through the crowd until she stood closer to the makeshift stage. Her eyes never left Shorty as he played, pouring passion into every note and filling every corner of the square. When he finally paused to take a breath, she stepped forward and, without hesitation, began singing with the chorus. Her voice, though not perfect, was clear and filled with emotion. Shorty looked at her, surprised, then smiled as he picked up the melody again with his trombone. The music went on for hours. Carol after carol, the square filled with laughter, hugs, and songs. The musical cones still played in some nearby homes, but their notes now blended with the human clamor of the square, their absolute dominance broken. When the final song ended, the crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Shorty lowered his trombone, exhausted but brimming with a joy he hadn't felt in years. Edith climbed onto the stage and, without warning, hugged him. It was a brief gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You made this happen," she whispered. "The city came back to life because of you." Shorty smiled, knowing there was nothing he needed to say. He looked out at the crowd, still applauding and singing in small groups, and knew his music had achieved something far greater than he'd imagined. It wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about creating something new, a world where the human and the imperfect could coexist with the modern. As the square began to empty, Shorty stayed on the stage, gazing at the stars shining in the clear night sky. Edith stayed by his side, and together they watched as the city, once cold and mechanical, now resonated with the magic of imperfection. On that Christmas Eve, the world felt warmer, more human, and Shorty knew, without a doubt, that he had found his purpose.